Hello all, this is Nick Haines from WCC's English Department and the Assessment Committee to walk you through how you can use your own course level assessments to map to our WCC institutional learning outcome and then ultimately to our SUNY general education learning outcomes. So as you can see here, this mapping document shows how our written communication ILO, that's our local WCC ILO, students will use writing for inquiry, learning, thinking, and to communicate ideas effectively, maps to SUNY's general education learning outcome of basic communication. In other words, this is our institution saying how it meets its own goals and how those goals align with SUNY's goals. Now we're going to talk about how you can use assessments in your own course to help us measure how well we're reaching those goals. So, our committee, along with much help from English department members and others, have gotten together and created this rubric used for written communication. This aligns with WCC's institutional learning outcome. In fact, the standards in this rubric come directly from that ILO. Students will use writing for inquiry, learning, and thinking is there, and communicating ideas effectively has just been fleshed out with clearly, precisely, and logically here in this standard. And you can see if you read through each of these areas how the gradations of levels of achievement increase in each of these areas. This is what we will use to break down our ILO results. Now, this is really just a mapping document, and you will not be assessing your own students' work based on this rubric necessarily. Instead, you'll use your own local rubrics for your own assignments and map them to this rubric here. So we'll talk about that now. Since I am from the English department and I teach English 101 writing and research, I thought I would simply use this annotated bibliography assignment, since it fits well, as an example of how you can use your course level assessments to create data that can be used to measure the ILO. So this assignment is for an annotated bibliography. Basically, a student must do some research on a topic and write an overview about what they want to learn and what they have learned already and what their working thesis is, and then list each of those sources and annotate based on these 5 areas, explain why the source is relevant and reliable, summarize it, respond to it, plan how they might use it in their paper, and then synthesize, in other words, explain how the sources kind of speak to each other. Now, here is the rubric that is used to score this assignment. So if I get a student paper, I would look at it in terms of this rubric, which is broken down based on what I just kind of showed you. So there's selection of sources, the overview, source evaluation, source summary, response to sources, source synthesis, MLA style, and correctness. That's 8 areas, and I use a point system to score mine. So basically this is 200 points. Each area is equally weighted at 25 points each. Now, this is going to be important later, so keep that in mind, that this is a 200-point system that I use that I'm going to have to convert in order to submit my results to the assessment committee. So I have this rubric, and then down here I've mapped the areas of the rubric to the ILO from WCC. So I've looked through each of my own assignment standards, selection of sources, overview, etc., all those ones I just went over. And this is where our own kind of ingenuity comes in and our own thinking about how our assignments map to the ILO. This is where you can look at that rubric, look at your own rubric, and figure out where there is alignment. So I've found that the selection of sources, which just measures how students have selected various sources. It doesn't ask how they wrote about them or anything like that. So it doesn't really assess a writing standard necessarily, is not relevant for this. But I did find that the overview, source evaluation, summary, response to sources, and source synthesis all map to this one ILO standard about using writing for inquiry, learning, and thinking. All 5 of those do that. And in fact, it's kind of a nice array of touching on writing for inquiry, where the overview asks them to examine basic questions, writing for learning, which summaries can show, and writing for thinking, which may be response to sources and source synthesis. And then the last two, they do map to communicates ideas clearly, precisely, and logically. But as you can see, these last two areas do not quite constitute the majority of this assignment. Now down here is where you can see why this becomes a valid measure for the ILO. Basically, this says if 60% or more of the score is based upon an ILO standard, the course level assessment is a valid measure of that standard. So here I can see I have 62.5% of the score of this assignment is based on that first standard. Therefore, I can report these grades as a measure of that standard. And that's what I'm going to hope to do. So basically, we will be able to use the scores generated from this, the broad scores generated for this, to measure that one standard from our written communication ILO. Now I have a student artifact here as just kind of an example of what I might score. And then down below here, without getting too much into the weeds of reading this assignment, I have my rubric score based on it. And so I've analyzed this reading and given it scores in all of these areas. Some were excellent, some were very good, some other areas were average. And I get my total score for the assignment, which as a point score is 165 out of 200. Now this is essential to point out. I need to convert this to a percentage score in order to submit to the committee. So 165 out of 200, it's easy, divide by 2, and you get 82.5%. And this is the score that might be used to measure that ILO standard, that first ILO standard. Now, if I had a list of student grades, and I had point scores for each student, what I would do is convert those to percentage scores. In my case, divide by 2, although I could imagine that could be a bit more complicated for other folks. And I get a percentage score for each student work. And what I would submit to the assessment committee, or whichever body will be collecting these scores for general education assessment, are the percentage scores. So I would submit to the committee these percentage scores and my own mapping. In other words, how well or how much my assignment maps to the ILO. And that would be it. That would be how I could help the institution go from our own local assignments and our own local rubrics and map those through something like this to our ILO, which then maps from the ILO to our SUNY Gen Ed Basic Communication Standard. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to working with you in the future and collecting those results. Thank you.